presentation of the day, the presentation dernier online. We're very pleased to have Professor Joan Costa-Font that's going to give the last talk on decentralization and equity. There were a lot of questions on equity early on, so we are really happy to have you. I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you well.
Okay, so Joan is a professor of health economics. He worked at Harvard University, he taught at the University of Barcelona. He published in the best journals in economics, in health economics. And so we're really pleased that he agreed to give the last talk of the day. The floor is yours for 45.
Okay, thanks so much for the invite, and sorry for having missed actually the conference face to face. Brussels is around the corner, so any excuse to come over is always welcome. So as mentioned, and hopefully it would complement other talks, I will be discussing the point on decentralization and equity, right? So decentralization and equity widely understood. So that will include issues around privatization, race to the bottom, and so forth. So what I was planning to discuss today is basically just try to summarize a bit some of our research. Some of it is together with Gilberto that just gave a talk before me. So I'll start from the very basics. What is that I understand as decentralization in a context of a publicly funded health system? Then I will discuss whether decentralization actually affects intra and inter-regional inequalities. Then I'll move on to the question about whether decentralization affects what we can call the race to the bottom, so whether it produces some type of privatization. And I'll zoom into one example from Spain, a recent paper we got out that we tried to illustrate and rationalize in some detail this question. And then we'll move into another paper that discusses how decentralization affected the way governments coordinated during the pandemic. And here is another paper with Gilberto where we compare Italy and Spain. Spain centralized under a single command the management of the pandemic, whilst in Italy there was more of decentralized action. And then finally, I'll just say a few things about the UK, which would be an example of a model of decentralization that we can call a federacy. Okay, great. So without further ado, you might find an extensive explanation of what I'll be talking about today in some of the papers that are already published. I just highlighted a few. And there is a book as well that we wrote on federalism and decentralization in European health and social care, and a chapter on a book that we wrote with Gilberto and Alberto Batindi on the political economy of healthcare. Before jumping to the conclusions, let me just pick where I was. I guess that what makes sense is to start off, defining what do we mean by decentralization. Essentially, when I refer to decentralization, I mean the decentralization of stewardship, right? So of the management of the decisions of a health system, right? So the stewardship of the health system, and that basically that decentralization is between different levels of government, right? Now, what's the difference between decentralization and federalism? Well, federalism typically applies when decentralization is constitutionally defined. So from an economic standpoint, it doesn't really matter whether a country is federal or not. You have very centralized federations and very decentralized unitary states, at least in Europe. But it is important just to make this point. And in principle, decentralization should affect the power to tax and the power to spend and regulate. You'll see in a minute that when it comes to healthcare, most of the action comes from the power to regulate and spend, because many health systems are funded through block grants, which is in a way a problem for many health systems, but I'm not really touching upon this, and I hope Gilberto has discussed this point. But why do countries decentralize? There's a number of reasons. There's political reasons for decentralization, but what's the economic argument for decentralization? Well, the argument comes all the way back to Hayek, information, we know that is spread. So that means that one size fits all. So one centralized government, one monolithic government is likely to fail, is likely to miss important information. And that means that only a decentralized government will be able to cater to heterogeneous preferences and needs. So think about, if you want to think about an example, think about, let's say, care for the elderly or care for children, right? So areas that have a higher concentration of older populations would probably want to prioritize long-term care, and those that have a higher concentration of children, they would probably want to prioritize childcare services, right? Or child-related health, pediatric units, right? And of course, a centralized system might not allow that, and that means that one would have to go for some kind of decentralization. On top of that, decentralization allows the mechanisms of the political agency to play out. So basically, it allows not just to cater to different preferences, but actually citizens can reward different governments, right, based on what those governments deliver, on the quality of care, as it happens in many European countries, that those governments deliver. Now, there is a cost to decentralization, that is the economies of scale that one loses by decentralizing. And of course, those costs are much larger the higher the spillovers of those responsibilities onto other levels of government, right? So those would be basically the main issues. And of course, the question is how to decentralize. And this is not so much a question that I'm going to touch upon, but there are different ways of decentralizing a health system. I'll just mention very briefly, one could decentralize like what we see in the UK, so only to the countries, to the nations, to the main communities of the country, purely driven by political reasons, or like in Belgium. Or alternatively, as we see in Spain or in Italy, decentralization doesn't necessarily need to match a political community, right? So in Spain, there's 17 autonomous communities, or in Italy, there's 21, I think, regions, right? And they don't necessarily need to match a political community, right? So that's what I call systems model, when they don't necessarily match a political community, whilst a federacy is when they actually match, let's say, the borders of a country, right? Now, the maths, I'm going to skip that, but essentially, if you can think of full decentralization when one government collects all the taxes and spends it uniformly across different individuals or across different territories, right? Decentralization is the opposite, when each territory collects its taxes and spends those taxes on its own citizens. Or alternatively, one could define what we can call partial decentralization, which is what we see in most European countries, which basically means that there is some level of taxation at different levels of government, right? And there are transfers, typically from the central government to different levels of government to compensate for potential imbalances, right? So that's roughly it. Now, why do we decentralize? I'm sure that's something you've already discussed, but essentially I was saying, basically you want governments to be politically and fiscally accountable, to match actually the delivery of the health system to the preferences and needs, right? And on top of that, there is another reason to decentralize, which has to do with policy innovation and experimentation. So experimenting with the entire country, experimenting with the entire country, as Napoleon would do, has Napoleonic consequences if things go wrong, right? So you don't want to experiment with the entire country. You want to experiment with smaller units, and if that experiment works, then diffuse it to the rest of the country. And that's what we see, for instance, in Scotland when it comes to smoking bans. They were introduced first in Scotland. The outcomes were positive. Then they were extended to the entire UK, right? COVID regulations, the same. There's been a bit of policy experimentation and diffusion, and we are actually working on that now. Now, the cost of decentralization, as I was saying, economies of scale, right? So if there's no much heterogeneity in a health system, then why decentralize? Because you could actually make use of economies of scale. Then spillovers, right? So if decisions in one jurisdiction affect another jurisdiction, then that responsibility should be scaled up. And that's an argument that has been made, for instance, to scaling up health security responsibilities to the European Union. There is a huge movement these days that claims for the creation of a European health agency, right? And that is primarily driven by the fact that many decisions on health security have spillover effects across countries. So it is inefficient to manage health security at the country level, right? Now, another cost that could arise from decentralization is coordination, right? So there are transaction costs in a decentralized system. Coordinating entails a cost. Now, in the evidence from, for instance, in Italy, shows that actually regions were pretty happy, at least at the beginning, to pass on the responsibility to the central government. They probably didn't think that there was much credit to be claimed from taking on responsibilities in the midst of a pandemic, right? And it didn't involve much transaction costs, right? So that's not always true. But it's true that in general, one would have thought that a centralized organization would face less transaction costs than a decentralized one, right? Another problem with decentralization is that it weakens the monopoly of labor unions. So it's not uncommon that labor unions are not very happy with decentralization. And it's true that not all countries are equally inequality averse or regionally inequality averse. So for instance, one could argue that, let's say in the UK or in France, for instance, people seem to be very inequality averse when it comes to the territory. They have this notion that equality means uniformity, which we know it doesn't make any sense, but they still hold on to this idea. So uniformity equals equality. But of course, in other parts of Europe, that's not the case, right? And they allow differences, diversity that results from matching healthcare to different needs, right? Okay, so healthcare, another point to remember is that it's generally a joint responsibility. So it is, so here is just evidence from a number of, let's say, Eastern European countries where healthcare, which level of government does healthcare lie. And what we find is that in most countries tends to be a joint responsibility. It is a responsibility that, as we know, those responsibilities that have high spillovers tend to be centralized. Those that have no spillovers, the rational thing to do would be to keep them decentralized. And then on top of that, we know that from the theory that there's at least two models of federalism that are sort of extreme. One could go competitive or American, right? Where basically we allow units to have their own taxes, to develop their own taxes, own taxation. Budget constraints are really hard. And in principle, that means that there is typically an upper chamber, right? But typically that upper chamber doesn't veto reforms. And alternatively, one could have a cooperative model like the German one, where the idea is that most of the taxes are shared, most of the decision-making is shared as well. So that creates decision-making traps. There is a framework regulation, and that's basically what we see in many European countries. So healthcare in Italy, in Spain, there is a framework regulation, and autonomy only applies within that framework regulation, right? And taxes are mostly shared, whilst in an American model, typically most taxes are decentralized, and there is far more freedom on the side of states, right? So that produces a different model. So the only competitive system in Europe would be perhaps Switzerland, but most decentralized models in Europe are more inspired, I would argue, with Germany than the US. And of course, inevitably, when one focuses on taxes, and I'm sure that that's something we've discussed, it's very difficult to measure autonomy because there's a lot of debate about how do you account for shared taxation, what do you do with transfers, are they conditional, are they unconditional? There is this famous flypaper effect. I'm not going to get into these details, but it is very difficult. So I'm very reluctant to accept that any measure of decentralization is actually delivering because of this. But I mean, what we see is that you can take, for instance, data from the OECD, and you could see that if you put together, if you map all the countries in the OECD, you clearly identify 3 countries that are openly outliers. So Switzerland, the United States, and Canada would be outliers, where we see significant subcentral autonomy with regards to taxes, whilst the vast majority of other European countries, what we see is that there is high level of decentralization, but mostly on the political end, as opposed to on the fiscal end of things. So now, hopefully everybody by now has an idea about what is that I mean by decentralization, right? So it means basically that the stewardship of the health system is in the hands of different levels of government, right? So is that good or bad for equity? Well, the first point to discuss is, let's say, equity between territories. And this is a table from a paper with Gilberto, where we look at Italy and Spain, and we look at two outcomes, a measure of quality and a measure of output. Output would be simply public spending per capita. And we look at the period before decentralization and after, right? So 1992 to 2002 would be basically pre, and then 2002 onwards would be post. And what we find is that when we take a measure of inequality like the Gini index, what we see is that inequality in output actually, if anything, decreased after decentralization. So the idea that decentralization increases inequalities, at least in Europe, is not, doesn't hold. And when it comes to quality, what we find is a different effect between the two countries, between Italy and Spain. In Spain, we know that there is very significant experimentation, and we know that inequalities in quality did increase after decentralization, whilst we see a little bit of an increase, but not massive in Italy, which is expected, because as I will argue in a minute, competition in decentralized health systems in Europe is mostly on quality. Now, one could, for instance, plot coefficients of variation of expenditure per capita over time and compare, let's say, a decentralized system like Spain to the UK. And what one finds is that if one compares England, which is the most centralized health system in Europe, to Spain, which is a fairly decentralized one, what can see is that decentralization in Spain reduces inequality, whilst it doesn't in a very centralized system. So the argument here is very much counter to what many people hypothesize, namely that decentralization, at least in healthcare, increases or doesn't do much with regards to regional inequalities, centralization, right? Whilst decentralization seems to manage to reduce inequality. So against the backdrop that decentralization increases regional inequalities, at least in measures of output of healthcare expenditure per capita, what we find is that that's not true, at least looking at Spain. And if anything, what seems to be, this data seems to be showing is that in England, the most centralized country in Europe, probably the most centralized health system up until now, because now they are experimenting with decentralization in Manchester, what we find is that inequalities are the highest. Now, when one looks at intra-country inequalities, intra-regional inequalities, what we see, at least in Spain, is no specific pattern. We don't see a high correlation between inequality and intra-regional inequality, so inequalities within the region and decentralization. So, for instance, Murcia, it was a region that was run by the central government and had really high intra-regional inequalities, whilst, for instance, Andalusia had sort of much lower inequalities and was decentralized, right? So clearly there is no pattern, at least when it comes to intra-regional inequalities and decentralization. Whilst we do find a pattern, a decreasing one, between inter-regional inequalities and decentralization. Great, so hopefully I've settled the second point, which is that it's not clear, if anything is the opposite, that decentralization increases inequalities. And then that takes me to the third point. So does decentralization increase privatization of the health system? Now, to answer this question, one needs to understand what does decentralization do. So decentralization, essentially what it does is that it brings competition between different health systems. So rather than having a monopoly of a centralized NHS that for the entire country, one has decentralized regional health systems that compete with each other, right? Now, the question is how they compete. Do they compete based on price or do they compete on quality? So my argument is that, well, in principle, in an ideal system, one would expect health systems to compete on both quality and price. Now, in Europe, what we see is that most of the competition is on quality. right? And on top of that, individuals don't move much from one region to another based on the quality of healthcare. What they do typically is they use the political system to reward those regional health systems that deliver better healthcare compared to others. And that is something we are working on, if anyone is interested. And on top of that, there is competition at two levels. One is horizontal, namely within regions at the same level, right? And as well vertical, so between regions and the central state. So what we find, for instance, in Spain or at the European level, what one can identify is competition between the federation and the states, right? And that's what we call vertical competition. Now, as I was saying, horizontal competition means basically competition between units at the same state. Typically because units are run by incumbents that need to be re-elected, they basically want to show that they are doing better than other regions, or they are doing something different than other regions. Given that they don't have many tax instruments to differentiate themselves, what they tend to do is operate on quality. So, for instance, they reduce waiting lists, they try to introduce programs, policy innovation programs that distinguish the region from others, right? So what that creates is some competition between regions on quality, which we will argue that rather than a race to the bottom, creates a race to the top. Now, how does that competition take place? Well, the argument that I was making a minute ago is it takes place through policy innovation. So this would be an example of policies that were first implemented by some regions in Spain, like Catalonia, the Basque Country, the Canary Islands, Andalusia, whatever, and then they were diffused, they were copied by other regions. So experimentation happened at the local level, and then that created some diffusion to the other regions, right? Now, on top of this horizontal competition that is driven by policy experimentation and quality, we know that there is competition between levels of governments, what we call vertical competition. So the idea is that the Constitution, at least in Spain, and you could argue that at the European level, in the Constitution, healthcare is unclearly distributed between levels of government, and that creates a space for competition. So region states tend to regulate on those areas that the government, the central government, has not regulated on. And that creates some level of competition that is allowed by this constitutional flexibility, and in the end, it ends up with lots of jurisdictional decisions by judges, right? That create some level of political pressure that it's rewarded, that ends up in a vote by its citizens, right? So that creates, let's say, competition for regions to do a little better than otherwise a central government would do, right? And finally, of course, one of the tricky things when it comes to decentralized health system is how to design systems that guarantee equity. So the design of grants and transfers, limits to divergence. So one could argue, well, we want competition, but we don't want divergence to exceed a certain threshold. And you could argue, well, that's quite open-ended, no? I mean, how much diversity you allow in the system. Then another problem with decentralized systems is information sharing, and you will see that came very important in the context of COVID. And in fact, what we find in the paper with Gilberto and so forth is that in the Italian system, regions seem to, because they didn't fully centralize in a one single command the health system, regions did share information with the central government, whilst that didn't happen in the Spanish context. And that meant that the lack of information sharing, because of centralization, not the opposite, created devastating consequences in terms of lives. And finally, one of the issues here, one of the potential risks of a decentralized system is that different health systems, regional health systems, can collude. And of course, collusion means that it kills competition, and therefore the health system doesn't reap the benefits of competition. So if there was a race to the bottom, I probably don't need to repeat this, but there would be like some competition between two health systems, 1 and 2 on prices, and eventually that would reduce the price of healthcare up to the marginal cost. Now, that's not what we observe. If one looks at health spending in most European countries, what we see is that whether the countries are federal, decentralized, or centralized, what we see is expenditure, if anything, seems to increase. So there is, if anything, a race to the top. Now, why don't we see a race to the bottom? Well, there's a number of reasons. One is because the competition, as I was arguing, is on quality. The other one is because the median voter is actually pro a larger government, right? And that's true even in the US. I mean, government involvement through federal government, especially after Obamacare, has increased dramatically. I mean, now it's at almost 40%. So it's at more or less European level. If one looks at expenditure per capita in the US and Europe, is very similar, public spending, right? On top of that, the US has a lot of private spending. But then another explanation actually is that there are lots of joint programs. So for instance, even in the US, what we observe is that Medicare and Medicaid are jointly financed between the federation and the states, right? On top of that, there are actually limits to how much citizens can link what they receive from the government and what they pay. So these, what we call Bixelian connections, are harder to make in many health systems. And what people do is they take proxies of quality based on waiting lists, for instance. Mobility tends to be restricted, as we know. There's very little mobility driven, there's little migration driven by healthcare. And matching grants, as I was saying, are the norm, right? So one of the issues with regards to equity is how to deal with vertical imbalances. So some regions do not, are less resourced than others, right? Both at the same level and between levels. So it could well be that certain central governments in many countries are much better resourced than regional governments. So what they do is they condition regional governments' funding to certain targets set by the central government. Now, that creates a vertical imbalance because that means that although the system is decentralized, is managed centrally. And that, of course, means that decentralization doesn't produce any benefits. And finally, horizontal imbalances exist, and those imbalances can be corrected through transfers, right? And we can discuss that if you want later on. Of course, in Europe, we have a long list of countries that have decentralized the health system. The UK would be the obvious one. Italy, Scandinavian countries were decentralized by default. Norway and Poland actually initially decentralized, were very decentralized, and what we are seeing is the opposite, a process of centralization. And that's because they have a completely different model. In the case of Poland, there was some level of, I understood, political corruption at the local level, so some level of local capture, which was one of the issues there. In the case of Norway, they thought the country is quite small, so small in terms of population, not in terms of space, and the issues were different there. But then, we know that many other health systems are decentralized. And of course, it is important to distinguish the European model to other models of decentralization. In Europe, what we have is that decentralization typically happens in the context of a public health system. So, decentralization is built up on a public and publicly funded healthcare, right? So decentralization introduces veto powers to changing that default model. And that means that, at least in Europe, what we observe is that decentralization seems to protect the health system from privatization, right? Whilst in the opposite is true in the US. In the US, we know that the health system is very decentralized, right? And that decentralization precedes the creation of a public health system, right? So what we see is that the veto powers in the US, what they do is they act as an impediment for the development of a further public healthcare. Now, I'm now taking you to one of the reasons or one of the arguments that I've made in a number of papers, but in particular in this one, where we show that actually devolution can have an influence on quality of care and the choice between public and private healthcare. I'm zooming into the case of Spain. Basically, the argument I'm making here is that when you have a centralized NHS, a centralized health system, typically it is very common that the health system fails short of expectations, so fails to deliver to heterogeneous preferences, right, in the population. So individuals have two options. One is to go private and buy private health insurance, or the alternatively, if there is a decentralized health system, they can actually support government proposals that attempt to reform the existing health system so as to look like, let's say, a neighboring health system, or that introduce those reforms that are more, let's say, acceptable in a region, right? So that's what we see in Spain. So regional choice as an alternative to market choice, right? That basically means that the health system creates a regional political cycle, right? So then the idea is that there is a regional median voter across the country, and what we observe is that decisions across the country tend to reflect different priorities across the health system. So the question is, does decentralization affect the quality of care, as we are arguing throughout in this presentation, and the choice of public versus private healthcare? Well, they do, right? What do we do? How do we test this? We use a difference in difference strategy. We compare regions that were centralized to those that were already decentralized 2 decades before, so they act as a treatment, as a control, I mean. And basically, we compare those regions that decentralized, that of course exhibited a change in the institutional structure, to the others on measures of quality, preferences for public and private healthcare, and preferences for the uptake of private insurance, which is basically the alternative to the NHS, right? So we know that, as I was saying, in Spain, funding is primarily via block grants. Only 2 regions are able to raise their own taxes, and expenditure hasn't changed throughout the period, so that's not really a driver of our association, right? So we believe, and that's what we argue in this paper, that the effect is through the political agency. So basically, decentralization creates incentives for incumbents to demonstrate that they are decent, and that they should be rewarded for their job by creating new policies, by introducing new policies. So for instance, in Castilla-La Mancha, they introduced a limit to waiting lists for surgical interventions, right? So there's a number of policy innovations that took place after decentralization, that essentially what they meant is that individuals were happier with the public health system and less likely to go private. And that's essentially what we show. It is important to bear in mind that Spain is the country that, at least in the Eurobarometer data, showed the highest satisfaction with the health system at the time. I'm going to skip this. The empirical strategy is a standard difference in difference. So we compare regions, as I was saying, that got healthcare responsibilities. It requires parallel trends, parallel pre-trends, and that's what we have. And our results basically seem to suggest that decentralization increases the perception that the public health system is working well by 7 percentage points, increases the preference for public healthcare, increases the satisfaction with public healthcare as well by 10 percentage points, and it reduces the uptake of private insurance. So basically, the alternative to the NHS becomes less attractive because the NHS is already delivering to individuals that have different regional specific preferences, right? And essentially that's what we show in these tables. And we did a number of robustness checks, looking at migration, excluding the 2 regions that were decentralized, excluding Madrid, accounting for for instance, the political cycle. We did a falsification test, so we looked at the impact of decentralization on policies that were not decentralized, like pensions or housing. We find no effect, or education, whereas we do find an effect for health. No? And then we find that these effects are slightly heterogeneous by region, by income, sorry. What we find is that particularly they cater to the low income and to on some grounds. And when it comes to preferences for the NHS, we find an effect across the income spectrum, right? Again, when it comes to education, same thing. Particularly individuals with middle education that might consider going private, they seem to be more reactive to this reform and less likely to go private. And then we find effects on age. I mean, most of our effect is driven by older individuals, basically, that they think that they might use the NHS more. And then we look at the political cycle. So we look at whether the regional the regional president, so the party that runs the regional health system, is the same as the party that runs the country, right? So whether there is a coincidence in political agencies across the central and regional governments, and we show that the effect that we were finding before exists even when we account for that, and even when we do a triple interaction effect, the net effect still holds up. Now, what are the mechanisms? Why is that decentralization seem to increase the use of public healthcare and deter individuals from going private? Well, what we find is that one of the mechanisms has to do with a small increase, but very small, 80 euros after decentralization. We don't think that this is the main driver because it's a small quantity anyway. But what we do find is a change in priorities. So governments, they can invest more in healthcare, taking reducing spending on other responsibilities that are decentralized. And on top of that, we know that we find evidence that decentralization increases satisfaction with specialist waiting times. So it seems that this evidence is consistent with the idea that decentralization increases actual quality of care. We don't find any effect on contracting out, so decentralization doesn't particularly increase the use of the private sector. We don't find any effects either on migration, which is very uncommon to move from one region to another based on healthcare. And we do find quite a lot of evidence, more qualitative evidence, on policy innovation, right? So for instance, Madrid introduced a new school nursing program, or prioritizes robotics. Extremadura and Balearics pioneered electronic prescription, and Castilla-La Mancha substitution of originators for generics, right? So there were a number of programs that, these are just examples of some programs that were introduced at the regional level, and that, of course, they were observed by patients, and the expectation of the incumbents would be that patients would reward with re-election those governments that were actually more active in healthcare, so they were improving the quality of the health system. Great, so that takes me to the almost final point of my presentation. So we've discussed decentralization, the effects of equity, we've discussed the effects on the race to the bottom, and we've argued that actually decentralization provides choice and is an alternative to privatization, right? So my final point is, in the context of a pandemic, when we have a shock that requires coordination, is it really a downside to have a decentralized health system? And here is where we compare Italy and Spain. In Italy, basically, the health system remained very much decentralized, although regions coordinated the health system. In fact, in Italy, unlike in Spain, there is no state of alarm in the constitution, so that made it a bit more difficult for the government, the central government, actually to do what Spain did, which was simply create a single command and, in a way, restrict decentralization. So why does the Italian system provide an advantage? Well, it did provide an advantage because it allowed actually regions to go a step ahead than what the government was doing. So for instance, we see in some regions like Campania, there were closure of borders. Lazio introduced flu vaccinations, or Le Marche, for instance, closure of educational institutions, right? And that's on top of what the government was doing, right? So typically what regions wouldn't do is challenge the government, but they were able to actually add additional restrictions, which actually proved, I mean, this is the evidence comparing Italy and Spain. And what we see is that no matter the measure you look at, confirmed cases, hospitalization, admissions to ICU, or mortality, Spain does much worse than Italy, right? So it seems that even in the context of a pandemic, a decentralized health system with coordination works well. Now, this only applied to the first wave of the pandemic. In the second wave of the pandemic, what we see is that even Spain allowed the health system to stay decentralized. So they did learn from the mistakes of the first wave, right? So, I've talked a lot about health systems that are very much systems models, where there's like a number of regions that they sort of look to each other and there is policy innovation. But does that apply across the board? Well, not necessarily. I mean, for instance, when one looks at the UK, and perhaps Belgium is a bit like that, where there's only like 2 or 3 countries, right? So the health system is organized around federacies. So there is like Scottish versus the English, the Welsh, and the Irish, right? Then what we see is that there's no parallel policy innovation. That we don't see as much policy innovation as we see, for instance, in federacies. But that might just be up until now, or it might well be that I'm wrong here. What we are seeing, though, is that from 2017, Manchester is developing its own health system, what is called DevoMan, right? And it's already showing a quite promising results. So there is evidence of reduced life expectancy in Manchester that seems to be due to decentralization, right? So in the case of Manchester, the argument is primarily driven by policy innovation. So they want to accelerate policy innovation, and they want to basically reduce the inequalities that result from England being such a centralized country. But altogether, what we see, at least in the UK, is that when you decentralize in a federacy model, the incentive is just to be different as opposed to copy each other. So for instance, if you look at policies like purchaser-provider split, we see it in 2 countries in the UK, but not in the others. Same when it comes to commissioning or payment by activity or the organization of foundation trusts. So it seems that England is actually the most active and the rest are simply going their own way, right? So at least in the context of a federacy, what I tentatively conclude is that we don't see the level of policy innovation that we see in other decentralized systems. So what I'm basically saying now is that not all decentralization delivers. It depends on the design, right? And what we see, at least in the UK, is that the different countries of the UK do not show dramatic differences in spending. If anything, spending is lower in England. So England is the most dynamic compared to the other countries of the UK, but actually spending is per capita is the lowest. So that takes me to the conclusion. So what is that we can conclude? Well, decentralization, that's my view, it's at least in European health system, is basically a response to the inefficiency of a one-size-fits-all health system, especially when preferences and needs are very heterogeneous, right? And of course, the question is how to design the health system, how to decentralize. Is there like a perfect decentralization model? And the answer is no, we don't have it, right? So it really depends how much vertical and horizontal competition you want to have, and how much you stimulate policy innovation, right? Now, what we know is that decentralization doesn't create a race to the bottom. If anything, in a context of a European health system, decentralization seems to protect a public healthcare system. And if anything, competition seems to steer quality. So it creates, if anything, a race to the top. Inequalities don't increase. If anything, what we see is that regional inequalities decrease. And I would argue that the debate around the evolution in healthcare should be more around political and fiscal incentives rather than other considerations. So I think I'll stop there. I haven't checked the time. I don't know whether I'm on time or not. Hopefully I am. And I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much. We can see if there are questions.
Sorry, I pressed the wrong button.
No, so thank you for the talk. Let's see if there are questions in the room. No, okay, so yes, okay, just 1 second.
My name is Christian Ormans. Thank you very much for your interesting presentation. A question concerning what the citizens think about those kind of changes. I don't know if it's an aspect that you have been analyzing as well in the different analysis you made. But in general, on this different evolutions, decentralization, the big questions or challenges that one's try to fix, do you have like have you seen reactions of how communities react on those evolutions? Like favorable or critical? That's something that would interest me to know if you have seen or observed this kind of reactions. Thank you.
Yes, thanks so much for the question. Yeah, so I mean, in a way, our study, the study that I presented before, it's based on data, survey data. So those outcomes that I was looking at, so satisfaction with the health system or preference for the public versus private health system, those are public opinion or it would be attitudinal, let's say, or survey-based outcomes, right? So so clearly, you know, what we see is a positive reaction from decentralization. Now, this positive reaction is more towards the outcomes of decentralization, not necessarily decentralization itself. So when you ask people whether the country should be more decentralized or less decentralized, I don't know what you would get, because most people are not informed or they don't really understand what it's all about, right? When you ask them about the outcomes, then you get a different answer, right? Now, why shouldn't we trust too much what people say? Well, because it depends how free the press is. In each country. So in some countries, the press does report a lot and quite accurately on the health system, whilst in other countries they don't. I mean, it depends on how political the press is, right? So these days, if you want to basically create a political sort of revolution in a country, all you need is to control like a few of the press outlets, no? I mean, like if you control 2 or 3 of the newspapers, then that would be enough, right? To create fake news that the health system is delivering or is not delivering, right? So I think that the press has a lot to respond, or a lot to say. It is in part responsible for creating narratives, and in countries where the press is actually I wouldn't say objective, because that's not possible most of the time, but when at least there is competition and there is free press, you would see stories actually being disseminated out there, and you would see that the TV outlets would portray those stories, and those stories would help to create actually an impression about the evolution of the health system. And then that's what we typically, at least in economics, we call perceived quality of care, right? So the perceived quality of care, most of us, we are not sick all the time, touch wood, right? And because we are not sick, we rely on those stories that are typically portrayed by the press. So those perceptions of quality, they could be affected by fake news, right? And that's why it's quite important that, that's what we are seeing these days, is that for democracy to deliver and for decentralized health systems to deliver, as a result, because they essentially use the political agency, so they use democracy on their advantage, they need a free press, no? And that's quite important. That's one of those areas that there is actually some research going on, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was to explain some of the conundrums in the discipline, right? So answering the question, we do see that decentralization changes attitudes. So it seems that people are happier with the health system, at least in some models of decentralization. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that public opinion surveys come out saying that the public is enthusiastic about further decentralization, because people's preferences are very much affected by media groups and media reporting. Thank you.
So you talked a lot about the competition mechanism, and you linked it to change the quality of the care that is provided after decentralization. And the way I imagine how that mechanism could play out, it would take time, right? Because you need competition to. It's not that right that next year after decentralization, competition is going to automatically increase the quality. So do you see anything like that in your paper, that competition effect takes time, and if yes, how long? And then my second question is related to one of your last ones about how many entities do you need to have competition. Obviously, if you're in Spain, you mentioned, I think, 21 states, but in the UK 4, in Belgium we have 3, maybe 4, depending how you count. So, yeah, if you really believe in that competition mechanism, I mean, what's the minimum you need to create that type of competition with a potential effect on the quality of the care that is provided?
Well, thanks so much. All those are very, very interesting, very important questions, I would say. I mean, the first one on how long it takes, actually, when it comes to policy innovation, that doesn't necessarily take a long time. For instance, in the case of Castilla-La Mancha, they introduced a new program in 2003, and decentralization took place in 2002. So it took them 1 year to develop a new program. In fact, the incentives are to be quick, because you have only like 4 years, a 4-year mandate if you're an incumbent in a region, to prove that you've done something, right? So the incentive is actually to introduce policies that produce some quick results that are visible. So I would say one of the criticisms, at least to my own paper, so acting critically, is that, of course, there might be incentives for decentralized health systems in focusing on visible policies, but that applies across the board. I mean, like politicians want to be re-elected, so they might focus on what is visible as opposed to what is more important, right? So that is a potential criticism. In terms of time, announcing a new program, that doesn't take too long, right? But actually, in our study, we allow for 5-6 years, even all the way to 7 years after decentralization, right? So it is true that we were allowing for some time for those programs to exert an influence on people's perceptions, right? So if we were cutting the data short, eventually you get so close to the decentralization point that you might not observe any effect, right? So it's true that you need to at least allow for some years. No? And now finally, the question on the number of is there a magic number of constituencies? Well, I would say the main argument here is that the mechanism of decentralization works through the political agency. So there has to be like a regional parliament, right, that coincide at each region, right? So you cannot have like too many constituencies because then you have to build like as many regional parliaments as constituencies, right? So for instance, one of the issues now in Manchester is they are using the local assembly of the Manchester Council as a quasi-parliament, but at some point one could expect like the Manchester region to develop its own parliament, or Yorkshire, etc., right? So there is a limit to that. So there are economies of scale effects that would say don't have too many constituencies because it might be that your efficiency gains are absorbed by the fixed costs, right? I'd say what we observe is Italy, we have about 20 regions would be something like the max, right? And you would need a minimum, and here is where we don't know where the minimum is, right? What we know is that when you only have 4 countries, like in the US, the UK, we don't see much incentive for policy for policy transmission. There might be some incentives for policy divergence, for policy innovation, but regions don't seem to copy each other. That might be a cultural effect from Britain. It might be that that's not the case in other parts of Europe. But I would say probably more than what we see in the UK. So more than 5 regions and less than 20. That would be basically the short answer. No?
Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Questions? Okay, so Jean, one more time, many thanks for your talk, and hopefully we're going to see you in person next time.
Definitely. Thanks for the invite. It was a pleasure. Thanks.
Merci à toutes les participants, à toutes les personnes qui sont intervenues aujourd'hui. Cette journée était bien intense. On a réfléchi déjà à comment essayer, avec l'accord évidemment de tous les intervenants, de voir si on ne pourrait pas publier des actes d'une manière ou d'une autre de la journée pour faire profiter d'autres des personnes qui n'étaient pas aujourd'hui des conclusions et des discussions qu'on a eues. On réfléchit aussi à une journée similaire pour l'année prochaine. Donc, si vous avez des feedbacks, des retours, n'hésitez pas à revenir vers nous. Alors, dernier point, c'est que vous êtes tous fatigués. Qu'est-ce qu'on fait quand... Voilà, le dernier, si on a parlé de beaucoup d'incitants aujourd'hui, on a le plaisir de vous inviter pour un verre de l'amitié, de ce que vous voulez à la sortie. Mais avant ça, on voudrait encore une fois remercier chaleureusement Claire et Manon qui malheureusement n'est pas là, et Émilie qui est par contre là. Voilà, sans elle, voilà, tout ça n'aurait pas été possible. Ils ont travaillé comme des... Vous n'imaginez pas comment ils ont travaillé. Donc voilà, un tout grand merci de la part de Dulbea, ici de la merci. Solidaris,